Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Indistinct Chatter. I'm Eliza, and before I get into today's episode, let's do a little news and a little news that you might have missed. So, the Iran war, still going, still escalating. We are now in the third week of the U.S. Israeli war on Iran, and this week things got even more intense. On Friday, Trump ordered strikes on Iran's Karj Island, which handles 90% of the country's crude oil exports. And in what I can only describe as a deeply unhinged moment, Trump told NBC News that U.S. strikes had totally demolished much of the island and said, and I quote, "We may hit it a few more times just for fun." Like, what the hell? What? Ugh. So much for being over very soon. And look, I already covered the economic ripple effects last week, gas, diesel, utility costs, but something that's getting way less attention than it deserves. Airstrikes on oil depots earlier this week caused what's being called black rain over Tehran. Usually, rain cleans the atmosphere. Not this time. Residents were dealing with sore throats, burning eyes, and oily, sooty residue all over the city. That's a public health crisis happening in real time, and I've seen maybe two articles about it. The other story that dominated headlines this week, and rightfully so, was the attack on Temple Israel Synagogue in West Bloomfield, Michigan on the 12th. A man drove his truck through the front entrance and opened fire. The attacker was killed by security, and the synagogue's director of security, Danny Phillips, was injured but is expected to recover, thankfully. All children in the early childhood center, some as young as 4 years old, were evacuated safely as well, over 100 of them. Clergy and staff are said to credit recent active shooter training for their rapid response. Honestly, it's a miracle that only one person was injured aside from the attacker. It's sad that we have to have active shooter training, but given the society that we're in, I'm glad it's a thing and it saves lives. Now, here's what I think got buried under these stories throughout the week. The National Institutes of Health funding situation is first up. This one has been building quietly, and I am baffled it isn't getting talked about more. The White House Budget Office has been blocking the NIH from spending its congressionally approved budget, restricting it to salaries and essential expenses only. And the result? The NIH has awarded only about 30% as many new grants this fiscal year compared to the same period over the last 6 years. 30%. We're talking cancer research, Alzheimer's research, pediatric disease research, all of it, just sitting there, waiting. To me, that should be pissing us all off. And I mean, we're already pissed off. I get it. There's so much, and this is just adding to it. I'm sorry, but this affects real people too. And I feel like it just got no attention. Also, barely covered, Afghanistan and Pakistan are actively at war with each other right now, like a real war. And most people have no idea. I only know because I was introduced to the World Monitor app. Check it out. And I saw on the map that it was red. On Monday, yesterday, an airstrike hit a drug rehabilitation hospital in Kabul, a 2,000-bed facility, killing at least 400 people and injuring 250. Pakistan says it only targeted military installations. Afghanistan disagrees, to put it mildly. This is a separate escalating conflict happening simultaneously with everything else, and it's just a lot, and I find it interesting that we aren't hearing more about it. And one more thing, this is good news. Researchers announced major positive findings this week on a new drug that could potentially end tuberculosis by 2030. TB still kills over 1 million people every year, and that story got like a blip, maybe less than a blip. But I thought you should know because, quite frankly, I didn't even realize TB was that big of a deal anymore. And little did I know, 1 million people every year. So this is huge news that we could potentially end it. As of today, there are a few things that are popping off in the news that I would be remiss not to mention. First, Trump's own counterterrorism chief, Joe Kent, resigned today, saying Iran posed no actual threat, inciting pressure from Israel. The man whose literal job was to assess whether we should be at war just said we shouldn't. Worth noting, worth paying attention to. Also, yesterday, Cuba experienced a complete island-wide blackout. 11 million people without power after a total collapse of their national electrical grid. And speaking of yesterday, did you hear about the lawsuit against Elon Musk's AI company, XAI? Well, neither did I. 3 teenage girls from Tennessee are suing because people used his AI chatbot, Grok, whatever it's called, to create fake sexually explicit photos of them, non-consensually, of course. Basically, someone took their normal photos from Instagram or yearbooks or whatever and used the AI to essentially undress them. These fake images were then shared in group chats. The girls are arguing that the company didn't have the right safety filters in place to stop this from happening. Once again, another example of how easily our public photos can be misused by technology, which is honestly, if you haven't noticed, it's why more and more people are not sharing photos of their kids online. Can you blame them? Sick people out there. This is a story/case that I think is going to be very important, and I encourage people to pay attention. Now, on to something a little more lighthearted. Awards season is officially over. Sad for me. The 98th Academy Awards, aka the Oscars, was held on Sunday, March 15th. First up, the actual wins, because let's celebrate the good. One battle after another took home 6 Oscars: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Supporting Actor for Sean Penn, Best Editing, and the very first Best Casting Award ever given. Now, that is a big deal. Best Casting is the first new Oscar category since Best Animated Feature back in 2001. So it only took them this long to finally realize that casting is also an art form. I mean, these are the people choosing the cast. Like, hello. They're the ones seeing the vision, the possibilities, the chemistry, the everything. Sinners won 4 Golden Statues: Best Actor for Michael B. Jordan, Best Original Screenplay for Ryan Coogler, Best Score for Ludwig Göransson, and Best Cinematography for Autumn Durald Arakpa. I apologize if I butchered her name. She became the first woman of color, and first Filipina ever to win that award. Sinners also set the record for most nominations in Oscar history with 16 nominations, beating out both Titanic and La La Land. And there was a rare tie in Best Live Action Short Film, only the 7th tie in Oscar history. Fun little fact. The tie was between The Singers and 2 people exchanging saliva. Now, I think I have to make a complaint. The production was so messy. I thought that I was just maybe imagining it, or I was being too critical while I sat at home in my sweats eating ice cream. But I've seen a lot of other people online saying what I was saying. First, I do want to say Conan's monologue I thought was great. It's fine. He's funny. Alongside with production, I felt like the mics were not picking up the audience reactions. So, and not even just him, but other presenters, when they would say a joke, it sounded like it was just landing on deaf ears. Like it landed flat. And I don't know if that's because people really weren't laughing or if the mics weren't picking it up. There was a lot of shaky camera work, a lot of awkward close-ups. There were often some audio bleeds from different sides of the theater. There was erratic muting of the house mics, and even the announcer, Matt Berry, he was doing his job from London, but I could only occasionally hear him. And I don't know if that was a Hulu thing I was watching on Hulu or what, but I don't know. And back to the tie, I think it was during one of the acceptance speeches for the ties. They straight up retracted the mic while someone was speaking, and then they cut the lights, and then they panned the camera to Conan, who looked at the camera and then was like trying to look away, like, what's going on? And then during the In Memoriam, when Barbra Streisand came out for her Robert Redford tribute, her mic was turned down, or the music was turned up too loud. Nobody raised her levels. They didn't cut the music while she was speaking, which, you know, maybe that was on purpose, but the music was so much louder than her mic, so I couldn't hear a single word she said. Other than that, though, the In Memoriam I thought was well done. It felt a lot more intentional this year, more slowed down. I mean, we lost a lot of Hollywood greats this past year, so it was just nice to feel like it was more than just another slideshow. And then, of course, the playoff music. I usually hate it anyway. Whatever. K-pop Demon Hunters got played off both times they won. The second time, A co-songwriter had just stepped up to the mic and the orchestra immediately started. They turned off the mic, they turned off the lights, the camera panned out. I don't know. I just thought it was so rude. And another just like cosmically ironic moment of the entire night, the cast of Bridesmaids reunited to present the award for achievement in sound. Now, I love that cast. I love that movie, one of the best, greatest movies. But it was ironic that they're presenting an achievement for sound while the sound at this award show was a disaster. Like the entire night, including during this monologue, Melissa McCarthy's mic sounded muffled or like maybe it was turned off or something was not right. Aside from all that, aside from my complaining, fashion, of course, amazing. The dresses were gorgeous. The suits, beautiful. Makeup, hair, everything. The acceptance speeches, none of them I felt like were rambling. You know, sometimes some acceptance speeches kind of ramble, much like I am doing right now. All right, now let's get into today's episode. It is still Women's History Month, so I've got some more stories about some incredible women, this time women who have had something stolen from them. So before I get into that, I just want to revisit something that I mentioned last week, the Matilda effect. The Matilda effect is when women's achievements are credited to men. It's not a fluke. It's not a coincidence. It's a pattern. And once you start seeing it, I guarantee that you can't unsee it. So let's get into it. Have you ever played Monopoly? You know, the game where you can just absolutely destroy someone, take everything they have, watch them mortgage their last property, and you can sit there all smug and not even feel a little bit bad about it? Well, you can thank a woman for that. And I guess technically you can thank a man for stealing the idea and changing it, but let's focus on the woman. Her name was Elizabeth Mudgee, also known as Lizzie. Lizzie was a modern woman for her time. When most women were expected to marry young, Lizzie supported herself as a stenographer and typist at the Dead Letter Office in Washington, D.C. She didn't marry until she was 44. And also, a stenographer, because I didn't know, is a professional trained to capture spoken words verbatim in real time using a shorthand machine. And they often do this to create exact court records, depositions, legal hearings, closed captioning, all that good stuff. In her 20s, she patented a device to help paper move through typewriter rollers, making her one of the fewer than 1% of female patent holders in that era. She was also deeply involved in the women's rights and Georgia's movements. It is said that she was influenced by her father, who was an abolitionist who once even traveled with Abraham Lincoln. She once placed a newspaper ad offering herself for sale as a young woman American slave to the highest bidder. And this was to highlight the lack of financial independence for women at the time, and it sparked a national conversation about gender inequality. In 1903, she invented a board game called the Landlord's Game. And here's the thing that makes this game so genius. She didn't just make a game. Like, it's not just a fun game. She made it on purpose as a political statement. So the whole point of the game was to show players how landlords get rich while tenants go broke. She literally designed it to teach people about the dangers of unchecked capitalism. The game was meant to piss you off. Think about it. Like, there are businesses downtown here who are wildly successful, but they can't stay because their rent is like $5,000 a month. My favorite restaurant, the Blind Pig, was so delicious and it got closed because rent just keeps going up and up and up, and these businesses can't afford to stay. The only businesses that get to stay are, guess what? Chains. We don't want chains. Anyway, she wanted to simplify the complex theories of economist Henry George, who argued that land belongs to everyone and only its unearned value should be taxed. She believed that once people saw how landlords could bankrupt tenants while enriching themselves, that they would demand reform. With her game, she included a dual warning, 2 sets of rules: 1, prosperity, where everyone won when wealth was created, and 2, monopoly, where the goal was to crush opponents. This was to prove that cooperation was morally superior to competition. She went on to patent it twice. And for decades, it spread organically through progressive communities like colleges, intellectuals, people who were into economic reform. People were playing it, loving it, tweaking the rules a little here and there as it passed from friend group to friend group. kind of like how recipes get passed around and everyone adds their own little thing, except this was a board game not about eating food, it was about eating the rich. And then it landed in the hands of a man. And ironically, the world ultimately embraced only the monopoly rules Lizzie had designed to warn them against. And his name was Charles Darrow. Charles learned the game, made a few small changes, and in 1935 sold it to Parker Brothers as his own invention. He became a millionaire, he became famous, he was called the inventor of Monopoly in the newspapers and textbooks and on the box itself for decades. Then, in 1973, Ralph Anspach, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Ralph, he was an economics professor at San Francisco State University, and he created a game called Anti-Monopoly. In his version, players started as monopolists, and then they would work to restore a free market. The Parker Brothers, which was owned by General Mills at the time, sued Ralph for trademark infringement, claiming they owned the exclusive rights to any game with Monopoly in the title. So, to defend himself, Ralph went on to spend a decade or so researching the game's origins. He set out to prove that the game was a folk game or an indie game with a history that preceded Charles. And wouldn't you know, during Ralph's research, he found Lizzie's original 1904 and 1924 patents for the Landlord's game, which were nearly identical to the modern Monopoly board. He discovered that for 30 years before Charles invented Monopoly, versions of the game had been played by Quakers, college students, Georgists, often on handmade boards. And if that's not enough, he found evidence that Parker Brothers had bought Lizzie's patent for $500 in 1935, specifically to bury it and protect Charles's rags to riches story that they were marketing for Monopoly. Ralph's case eventually went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1983, the courts ruled in Ralph's favor, allowing him to use the name Anti-Monopoly. The trial itself brought Lizzie's name into the public eye for the first time in 40 years, and it exposed that Charles hadn't invented the game in a vacuum. He learned it from friends who were playing a version of Lizzie's original creation. Now, sadly, Lizzie died in 1948 before she got the proper credit she deserved. So every time that you flip the board and you yell, "Hey, you owe me rent," you're actually living inside Lizzie's invention, in her idea, her political commentary about wealth and greed. And now it's being sold as a game that makes you celebrate wealth and greed. And I think she would have some thoughts about that, I'm sure, because the irony of all this is that the entire legal battle over monopoly versus anti-monopoly proved the very point that Lizzie had tried to make with her game. Powerful entities will use their wealth to crush competition and control the narrative. Today, Hasbro owns the brand and they still focus on Charles and its marketing. However, historians and museums are now giving credit to Lizzie as the true creator. So, next time that you have a family game night and you pick Monopoly, maybe try it Lizzie's way. Play until everyone has created wealth instead of just one single person monopolizing everything. And also, this proves that you don't have to buy the game. Like, you can make it with a homemade board and homemade pieces. Okay, I briefly mentioned Hedy Lamarr last week. I think I said something like, don't thank Google Maps, thank Hedy Lamarr, and I stand by that. But I didn't give her nearly enough time, so I'm going to fix that. Hedy Lamarr, born Hedwig Eva Maria Keisler, was one of the most famous actresses in Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s. Like, genuinely a massive star. MGM called her the most beautiful woman in the world. She was on posters and magazines, basically just glamour personified. She rose to international fame after a very controversial role in 1933's film Ecstasy. After fleeing an unhappy marriage, she met MGM mogul Louis B. Mayer, who is credited for her rebrand to Hedy Lamarr. Basically, Hedy found acting boring, so she used her spare time to co-invent a military communications technology that became the foundation for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS. She was also a frequent collaborator of Howard Hughes, even suggesting he redesign his airplane wings to be more aerodynamic by studying the shapes of birds and fish. So, it's a bird, it's a plane, or is it a fish? Let me back up, actually. So, Hetty was born in Austria. Her first husband, a man she married at 18 and later escaped from, was an Austrian arms dealer who did business with the Nazis. And because he brought her to business meetings and dinners thinking that she was just decoration and arm candy, she quietly absorbed an enormous amount of technical knowledge about weapon systems and military communications. She eventually fled that marriage. There are some wild stories about how, including one version where she disguised herself as a maid to get out, and she made her way to Hollywood. But she never stopped thinking about the war. She wanted to help defeat the Nazis. So she teamed up with avant garde composer George Antheil and developed something called frequency hopping spread spectrum. The idea was to make radio controlled torpedoes harder for enemies to detect or jam. Instead of broadcasting on one frequency, which enemies could find and block, the signal would hop rapidly between frequencies in a synchronized pattern only the sender and receiver knew. Kind of like piano rolls. You know what I'm talking about? Like if you have an old music box, look at where the music's coming from. You know, the little ping pings that roll, like it looks like braille on a rolling pin that tings on a little metal bar. Do you know what I mean? I'm really bad at explaining things. The system worked kind of like that. It made radio signals hop across 88 different frequencies, making them impossible for enemies to intercept. They patented it in 1942 and they donated it to the US Navy for free because there was a war going on and she wanted to help. The Navy shelved it. They dismissed the idea as too complex at the time. Instead, they told her that she would be more useful selling war bonds, which she did, and she raised over $25 million. No big deal. Her patent expired in 1957 before anyone used it commercially. And then in the 1960s, the military finally started using it. But by then, the patent was gone, so she received nothing. No credit, no compensation. And it didn't stop there. Frequency hopping spread spectrum is the core technology behind Wi Fi, behind Bluetooth, behind GPS. Your phone works partly because of Hedy Lamarr. It's why internet companies use spectrum in their names. She spent most of her life being celebrated for being beautiful and not for being brilliant. And it wasn't until 1997, when she was in her 80s, that she and George were finally given the Electronic Frontier Foundation Pioneer Award. She reportedly said upon hearing the news, and this is iconic, "It's about time." She died in 2000 and she was inducted posthumously into the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 2014. Now, next up, I have a quick one, but a good one. And yes, I am putting these two back to back on purpose because they're kind of on theme with each other because of GPS. Look, it's my show. I pick how things are related. Hedy Lamarr, beautiful woman, assumed to be decoration, secretly inventing revolutionary technology that the world dismantled and then stole. Next up, Mary Anderson, a woman with a completely practical idea told by men that nobody would ever use it. Mary Anderson was an Alabama-born real estate developer and rancher and inventor. So let's take it back to 1902. Mary Anderson is visiting New York City in the winter. She's on a streetcar. The driver keeps having to open the front window. He's letting in freezing air and sleet. He also keeps having to stop and get out to wipe snow and sleet off the windshield because he can't see. And Mary thinks, gee, there has to be a better way to do this from inside the vehicle. She goes home to Birmingham, designs a spring-loaded controlled arm with a rubber blade that the driver could operate from inside the vehicle using a lever. Basically, the driver would turn the handle to sweep the blade across the glass, and a counterweight ensured that the blade stayed in contact with the window. She was granted U.S. patent number 743,801 on November 10th, 1903. When she tried to sell the rights, a Canadian manufacturing firm wrote back and told her that her device lacked practical value and they weren't interested, basically saying it didn't have commercial value. Critics argued that the movement of the wipers would distract the drivers and cause accidents, as if the snow blocking their vision wouldn't. Her patent expired in 1920, just as the automobile industry really began to pop off. Not a single sale in those 17 years. Then, in 1922, Cadillac became the first car manufacturer to make windshield wipers standard equipment using a design based on Mary's original work. And then the auto industry just started putting windshield wipers on every single car to become standard equipment for all of them. Mary saw nothing from it, no licensing fees, no royalties, no credit, just a thing that became so normal that no one thought to ask who invented it. That is until 2011, decades after her death, when she was posthumously inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Also, just to note, Charlotte Bridgewood, a Canadian born American inventor and entrepreneur, took Mary's concept to the next level. Women inspired by women. We love to see it. Charlotte brought us the automatic version, the electric version. And much like Mary, her invention was scoffed at and considered too complicated for the average car. So, every time it rains or snows, or you're getting that bug off your windshield, and you just automatically reach for that little arm, lever, whatever it's called, that's Mary Anderson. That's Charlotte Bridgewood. And they were told that their ideas had no practical value by men. I don't know. I'm seeing a theme of maybe men don't always know what's best. Just a thought. And finally, I bring you Cecilia Payne Gaposchkin. That's right. She hyphenated her last name, which was not common at the time. The standard expectation was for women to fully adopt her husband's surname upon marriage, but she deliberately chose to keep her maiden name and hyphenate it for professional continuity. Anyway, Cecilia was a British American astronomer, and in 1925, she completed what is widely considered one of the most brilliant doctoral dissertations in the history of astronomy. What she figured out was that stars are made mostly of hydrogen and helium. That might sound simple now, but before Cecilia, scientists assumed the sun and other stars were made of the same basic stuff as Earth: iron, silicon, rock, basically just little balls of Earth floating around. She looked at the spectral data and said, no, it's hydrogen. Overwhelmingly hydrogen, like 1 million times more abundant in stars than what was previously thought. She did the work, she had the data, she had the conclusion. Her advisor, a man named Henry Norris Russell, told her that she was wrong, that her conclusion was impossible. He pressured her to add a disclaimer to her own dissertation saying her findings were, quote, almost certainly not real because they contradicted established theory. So she did what she was asked. Because, I mean, what else do you do when your advisor tells you to do it and you're a woman in the 1920s? 4 years later, Henry did his own analysis. And wouldn't you know, he reached the exact same conclusion. He published it, he got credit, his name went into the textbooks, and he's still often incorrectly credited with the discovery. Cecilia spent years as a footnote in a discovery that she made first. So let that sink in, okay? She was pressured to doubt herself in writing about something she was completely right about. And then she watched the man who pressured her get celebrated for it. I'm going to back it up a little bit more again because she's impressive on like a million different levels. Even though she completed her studies at Cambridge University, they refused to grant degrees to women until 1948. Cecilia was also the first person, man or woman, to earn a PhD in astronomy from Radcliffe College, which is Harvard's sister college. She then, for decades, performed the duties of a professor at Harvard while officially holding low-paid titles like technical assistant because Harvard's president refused to appoint a female professor. Then, finally, in 1956, she became the first woman promoted to full professor at Harvard and the first woman to chair a department there. Also, when I was digging, I found that she basically saved her husband's life. She met Sergei Gaposchkin, a Russian astronomer, in 1933 in Nazi Germany. She helped him escape persecution by securing him a visa to the US. Basically, too, like, because he's Russian, the Germans thought he was a Russian spy. The Russians thought he was a German spy. He was not in a good place. They were married the following year, and together they became quite a prolific scientific duo. Now, eventually, slowly, history is starting to correct itself about Cecilia. emphasis on slowly. Astronomer Otto Struve later called her dissertation the most brilliant PhD thesis ever written in astronomy. But for decades, she was the woman who was told she was wrong about the thing that she was absolutely right about by the man who then got famous for being right about it. Oh, and this is kind of cool. An asteroid was named after her, 2039 Payne-Gaposchkin. And also, a volcano is named after her on Venus. Just so cool. There's a lot more to her than what I talked about today. I encourage you, if you like stars, if you like astronomy, look into her if you haven't already. Space freaks me out, and I was even fascinated by her. So she used light to read the stars. All that being said, did you see the pattern? Lizzie, Hetty, Mary, Charlotte, Cecilia, different fields, different eras, but the same story. Woman does work, world, aka man, says no or ignores it or takes it. Man gets credit, man gets money, man gets put in the history books. And like I mentioned last week, for every one woman mentioned, there are 100 more who were written out of history. So, please, I encourage you to start looking around your house, do a little deep dive, find out how the invention came to be, then do some more digging. Keep asking yourself who actually did the work. Keep looking for the name that got left out of the history text. And when you find one, tell me, leave a comment, send me a message, tag me at indistinct.pod on Instagram. If you liked today's episode, please rate and review, share it with a friend. It really, truly helps more than you know. It helps get stories like this into more people's ears. And knowledge is power, right? Oh, and one last thing before I go. Today is St. Patrick's Day, so happy St. Patrick's Day. Hope you're wearing your green, drinking your Guinness, call your Irish grandma, do it up. But also know this. There was once a second day of St. Patrick's Day celebration, March 18th, called Sheila's Day, named after a woman, possibly Patrick's wife, possibly his mother, depending on who you ask. It was widely celebrated by Irish communities for centuries, and then it just disappeared. Meanwhile, Patrick's Day became a global phenomenon. Sheila was written out of her own holiday, which honestly feels very on brand for today's episode and just women's history in general. So, anyway, happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. Tomorrow, happy Sheila's Day. Thank the women in your life. They've more than earned it. We will chat next week. I love ya. Love you. Bye.